ethics can be something that we often overlook as far as public speaking goes because it's just something that's not at the forefront of our mind. A lot of times, what we're concentrating on is selecting a topic, focusing that topic, organizing the speech, and so forth. But ethics can actually be of great concern to a public speaker. Speech making, as we've discussed before, speech making carries heavy ethical responsibilities because it is a form of power. So when we create our speeches, we have to think from an ethical standpoint and make sure that we're being ethically responsible because as a speech, or excuse me, as a speaker, we carry some form of power with that. So a listener's ethical obligations include things such as being courteous, being attentive during a speech, and just maintaining the free and open expression of ideas. So the ethical concern there is not just with being the speaker, but it's also being a listener as well. So after all, the ethical issues that can arise, are numerous as far as speech making goes and also as being a listener goes as well. So it's things that we have to be aware of in the speech making and delivery process. Excuse me. Now, in our society, we're often called to make communication choices that have some form of ethical implications. We have to think in terms of, is something, right? Is it wrong? Is it harming others? Is it causing unjust harm to others? And so forth. So we always have this ethical question as far as our society goes. And I do want to note that ethics can be different from person to person. It's more of a internal belief system that we have. However, here's a good question to think about. If something is legal, does it make it ethical? That's something that's interesting to think about, isn't it? Well, just because something is legal, it doesn't mean that it's ethical, right? It's not illegal to tell a lie to someone, but it doesn't make it ethical. It's not necessarily illegal to pass on, hearsay or rumors or so forth, but that doesn't mean that it's ethical. So these are things that we have to take in consideration as far as speech making goes. Now, you make ethical choices in your life when you choose to defend your beliefs or remain silent on something. You also make ethical choices when you decide to respectfully listen or refuse to listen to someone else that has a different perspective. So again, we make these ethical decisions when we decide to listen to someone or if we just choose not to listen to them as a whole because they have a different opinion than we do. We also make ethical choices when we decide to check facts or we just decide to knowingly pass on faulty information. Or also, I'd like to add to that when we decide to not fact check what we've heard before we pass it on. And also there are ethical choices in terms of crediting your sources or plagiarizing material. And we always want to make sure that in our speeches that we give credit where credit's due. Not only does that avoid plagiarism, but also it just brings more credibility to your speech. It adds something there for the listeners to go, wow, this is a responsible speaker, and I think they deserve me listening to their ideas. So we do this with, of course, we include references and things like that with our materials, but we also make sure that in speeches, it's very important that a speaker verbally cites their references, resources, and so forth. And we can do this by a simple according to whoever it was and then giving the quote. We also want to make sure that, and of course you can phrase that any way you'd like to, but that's just a easy thing for you to remember as to how that would be able to be integrated in your speech naturally. Because we don't want to get to the end of the speech, and because I've heard students do this before, get to the end of the speech and go, by the way, all of my references came from da 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 da, or they do it before their speech. No, you have to verbally cite when you're giving off the information in your speech. So you might say, according to, let's see here, according to the University of Alabama, well, let me start over here. Trying to think of one off the top of my head. According for the Center for Disease Control, the flu is on the rise this year, or influenza is on the rise this year. I don't know. My mind is obviously not thinking of a great example for you right now, so I'll move on from that. But you got to verbally cite those sources, and that just lends more credibility to your speech, and it also helps you to avoid plagiarism. So ethics. What is ethical communication? Ethical communication is the conscious decision to speak and listen in ways that you, in light of your own cultural beliefs, consider right, fair, honest, and helpful to others as well as yourself. So ethical communication should be at the heart of what we do as far as communication goes. Now, here's an important thing that a lot of students also say, and I've heard individuals say in general, the U.S. Constitution guarantees freedom of speech. So a lot of times they will say things like, well, it's free speech. I can say whatever I want to. Well, that's something to really think about there, isn't it? So we know that the U.S. Constitution guarantees freedom of speech, but you have to balance your rights with your responsibilities as well. So I think a lot of times that gets lost on certain people. And we actually have a term for that we call rights abilities. And rights abilities focuses on both the rights and responsibilities of the communicator when we communicate. Now, diversity is something that we also tend to overlook as far as communication goes, but diversity can be a wonderful thing. It can be a positive thing if we allow it to be. And I think that's an important thing to note there is if we allow it to be. People who come together from different backgrounds, different situations can and often do come together in productive ways. In fact, I love being on a team of individuals that come from different backgrounds and just see things differently than I do because it lends so much more insight to the group environment. So things that we need to be aware of as far as diversity goes, though, especially as a speaker and just a communicator as a whole, we need to be aware of ethnocentrism. Now, you might say, what in the world is ethnocentrism? Ethnocentrism is the tendency to see the beliefs, values, and customs of one's own culture or group as right or natural. So one more time, ethnocentrism is the tendency to see the beliefs, values, and customs of one's own country or group as right or natural. So is ethnocentrism absolutely a bad thing? Well, it's a part of every culture, and it can play a positive role in creating group pride and group loyalty. So in that light, no, it's not necessarily all bad. But it is something that we do need to be aware of. So in some situations, when we have ethnocentric point of views, it can unfortunately lead to prejudice, hostility towards different racial, ethnic, religious, or even cultural groups. So it is something that we need to be aware of. It's something that we need to keep in check, so to speak. And I think it's important as a speaker to do so. Oh goodness, hold on. There we go. Okay. So to be an effective speaker in a multicultural world, which is what we live in now, we need to, as a speaker, we need to remember that all people have special beliefs and customs, and we need to have a form of respect for that. It doesn't mean that you have to believe in it, and it doesn't mean that you have to use it in your own life, but it is something that we need to take into consideration because we can't reach people unless we understand where they're coming from. Okay, so let's talk about listening for a minute. Again, this is another thing that I think is often overlooked in the communication process, but listening is a vital part of our communication process. We listen a lot of times more than we actually verbally communicate to other people. Listening is our most commonly used skill in most situations. So listening skills, why are they essential? Why is this something that we need to pay attention to? Listening skills are essential for a lot of reasons, but a few here that I have is listening takes up a lot of our time. So if you're doing something for that much time, you want to make sure that you're good at it, that you're using your skills properly. Good listening skills are also just good job skills. So if you remember, I discussed in, I believe it was the previous lecture, that we discussed how vital communication skills are in our job market nowadays, and how employers are really looking for employees or potential employees with great communication skills, sometimes even over experience. So good listening skills are good job skills, and it's something that can definitely help you to get that job, or better yet, help you to succeed in that job once you do obtain it. Perhaps gain a promotion, or more responsibility, or whatever that might be. Good listening skills are also good academic skills, as we all know. When we choose to listen in the academic environment and we choose to actively listen, a lot of times we better take in the information. We're able to do better on assignments, exams, and just course projects as a whole. Also, listening and being heard empowers people and it aids relationship development, growth, sustainability, and so much more. So, when we've ever been in a situation where we didn't feel like people were listening to us, you can think about how that made you feel. So, when you're in a relationship with other people, it doesn't have to be a significant other, it can be children, family members, friends, colleagues, you know, classmates. You have to understand that when you choose to listen to that person, you're choosing to empower that person and you're aiding in the development and growth in that relationship. And also, another thing to keep in mind is that in any given situation, we have an investment in that listening situation. Something is always at stake. When you choose to listen to your significant other, for example, you're choosing to foster the growth of that relationship. When you choose not to listen, then you are making a choice, unfortunately, to possibly hinder the growth of that relationship or make it become stagnant. The same could be true in friendships, like I said, with colleagues, with um, just friends, family, so much more. There is always a choice in listening, and we have an investment in every listening situation, whether we realize it or not. So one of the ways that listening can serve you is by enhancing your skills as a critical thinker. There are 4 different types of listening that I want to discuss. Excuse me. There is appreciative listening, that is listening for pleasure or for enjoyment. Good examples of that would be I was listening to Pandora a while ago, and I am a big fan of jazz, especially big band. Um, so I was actually using my appreciative listening skills for that. And some other examples there would be, like I said, music, listening to a comedy routine and entertaining speech. Things that you're listening to for pleasure or enjoyment would be using your appreciative listening. We also have empathic listening, and that's going to be listening to provide emotional support for the speaker. A good example of this would be when a therapist listens to a patient or when we lend a sympathetic ear to a friend, we're using empathic listening. Then we have comprehensive listening. Comprehensive listening is listening to understand the message of the speaker. For example, comprehensive listening could be classroom lectures like you're listening to now. You are listening. I would love to say that you're using appreciative listening, but we know you're not. We are not using empathic listening, nor are we listening critically, which we'll discuss in just a moment, but you are using your comprehensive listening, and that's going to be listening to understand the message of a speaker. So classroom lectures are a great example, or just direction to a person's home or to how to get somewhere in general. That is comprehensive listening. And then we have critical listening. And critical listening is often confused with comprehensive listening, so it's important you understand the difference there. Critical listening is listening to evaluate a message for purposes of accepting it or rejecting it. For example, when we listen to a sales pitch or we're trying to decide what vacation package is best for us and we're listening to a sales agent or something like that, a travel agent, we're using critically listening skills. We are deciding to evaluate a message for the purposes of accepting it or rejecting it. When we listen to a campaign speech is another great example of critical listening. So what about barriers to listening? Well, most of us don't begin our day, I hope not at least, by saying, today I'm going to be an absolutely terrible listener. I'm not listening to anyone. Of course, we don't start off our day like that. I truly believe that we intend to listen and listen actively, but we face language barriers, cultural barriers, personal barriers, linguistic barriers as well. Understanding these barriers, though, and really seeing how they are part in most listening situations can help us to plan strategies to deal with them better and also just to build our listening skills as a whole. So what are linguistic barriers? Well, sometimes the speaker's language is a barrier in listening. Diverse cultures usually include many different language variations. This could be different accents, which you're probably hearing from me right now. I'm very Southern, and I have a strong Southern accent. So that could be a language barrier. Of course, there are different dialects, use of slang, and so much more. One important thing I want to talk about here, though, is in terms of linguistic barriers, is jargon. The use of jargon in communication can definitely create a linguistic barrier for your listener. Jargon is the specialized words or expressions that are used by a particular profession or group and are difficult for others to understand. I'll give you some examples of jargon in just a little bit, but that is something to keep in mind as a linguistic barrier. Now, linguistic barriers show up in both language and vocabulary differences. So it doesn't just have to be that we speak a different language from the other person. For example, I'm speaking English and the other person speaks Spanish. That's not the only form of a linguistic barrier. It can also be, like I said, vocabulary differences, such as choosing to use technical jargon, or even people that just have an extensive vocabulary and perhaps it's um, using words that you don't understand correctly. So how to overcome linguistic barriers? To overcome linguistic barriers, we need to work to listen very carefully and see if you can gain meaning from the general context of the speech. A lot of times we can use context clues in the sentences that people say to help us understand what they mean. Another example, and this especially works in business meetings or classroom settings or, just things like that, we can take notes or jot down words to look up later and make sure that we're clearly understood that person. Now, as a speaker, I want you to work to, if you know that linguistic barriers are going to be present in your speech. For example, let's say that you're doing an informative speech on a certain kind of medical condition or disease or something like that. A lot of times there can be a great deal of jargon in that type of speech. Let's say that you're doing a demonstration speech on how to um, change the oil in your car. Well, if you're talking in terms of the mechanics of a car and so forth, it can be a little bit of jargon that can creep up in that speech. So what we can do as a speaker is first we can work to define the terms. So if we do feel that that word is just imperative for us to use in the speech for whatever reason, we need to make sure we fully define what that word means for our listeners. And also just to translate the jargon as a whole. So if you're using jargon, you need to make sure that you are translating that for your listeners so that they fully understand what it is you're saying to them. Now, linguistic barriers are not the only barriers to listening. We also come across cross-cultural barriers. And, we have to consider and keep in mind that comprehension of certain things depends on our ability to understand cultural allusions, cultural references. So an example of cultural allusions are, well, actually, before I do the example, I need to define my term, don't I? Cultural allusions, by definition, are references to culturally specific, historical, literary, or religious sources. So a lot of times, the meaning of what we are speaking about is based in our own culture, or our own frame of reference. So I want you to think about this. Can you think of anything familiar in your own culture that would confuse someone else? Well, I think a great example of this, for me at least, would be Mardi Gras. In my area of the world where I live, excuse me, just one moment. Okay, so in my area of the world where I live, we are the home of Mardi Gras in the United States. A lot of people confuse that and they believe that it's actually New Orleans, but New Orleans is definitely more commercialized, but we are actually the historical home of Mardi Gras in the United States. So, if I were going to talk about Mardi Gras and just assume that you know all those things, I would be, using a cultural illusion and something that may not be familiar to you. So your comprehension level might not fully be understood there. Okay, now each group in our society draws from different resources and backgrounds and so forth, and we need to make sure that we remember that. Don't forget that the knowledge, experience, goals, values, and attitudes through which each listener filters a message is called the listener's frame of reference, and we all draw from our own personal frames of references. So being someone that's grown up in this area of the world, my cultural reference for certain things, or excuse me, my frame of reference for certain things is going to be different. And it's not just based on certain cultures. Um, each person, no matter if you belong to the same culture, the same religion, the same backgrounds, whatever, we all have different frames of references because we've all had different life experiences. So that's something that we definitely need to keep in mind as we develop a speech. It's also up to the speaker to be sensitive to the differences and explain cultural allusions when possible and when used in speeches. So not only do we possess linguistic barriers and cultural barriers to listening, but we also have personal barriers to listening. And that's going to be personal distractions, basically, that hinder listening. Many personal factors can hinder listening, but these are a few that I wanted to just talk about real quick. For example, physical factors. Physical factors which can hinder listening might be bodily conditions that can limit your desire or ability to listen. Another thing might be psychological factors. And psychological factors could be mental stressors or distractions that take away from your desire or ability to focus. So like I said, this physical factors can just be the physicality of not being able to listen, a bodily condition. So then we have the psychological factors, or those mental stressors that we have, or distractions that take away from your desire or ability to focus. If we're under a lot of stress sometimes, we're unable to physically listen. We just can't do it at that point in time, and it can definitely create a barrier in the listening process. And sometimes we have prejudices, and those are just preformed biases or judgments, whether positive or negative, about something. Now, being prejudiced doesn't just mean in terms of a race or a religion or something like that. It can just be any kind of preformed bias or judgment that we have on something. Okay. Then also stereotypes is another personal barrier that we want to be aware of and try to avoid, because it can definitely hinder our listening as well. So when we place someone in a category and then assume that that person fits the characteristics of that category for whatever reason, we're choosing to stereotype someone, something, an event, whatever it is. And that can definitely hinder our listening as well. So when we come into situations when we have these preformed biases and we have these preformed notions of certain things, it can definitely hinder our listening as a whole. Now, poor listening. There are 4 major causes to poor listening, and they're not all as obvious as you might think. Listening too hard can be one of the major causes of poor listening. So sometimes you're just listening too hard. So trying too hard to take in everything that a listener is saying that a speaker is saying, can cause us to miss the speaker's main points or even confuse the facts as a whole. Rather, what we might want to try to do is try concentrating on main points and the evidence that they are presenting. Try not to focus on every single word, because sometimes we get lost in that, especially when we're talking in very technical terms. Jumping to conclusions is another major cause to poor listening. This is when we, so to speak, put words into the speaker's mouth. This is one reason we often communicate so poorly with others that we are closest to. We are sure that we know exactly what they are trying to tell us because we know them so well. But actually what we're doing is we choose not to listen when that happens, and we really miss what they're trying to tell us. Another thing is sometimes we just prematurely reject a speaker's ideas as boring or even misguided. And when we do this, it can cause us to miss out on some great information. In turn, you often cheat yourself if you choose to prejudge or just choose not to listen to someone as a whole. Like I said, you could miss out on some great information, and no one wants to do that. Another major cause to poor listening is not concentrating. So although we can talk at a rate of 120 to 150 words a minute, the brain can actually process 400 to 800 words a minute. Now, with those numbers being said, it seems easy to listen, right? Because if we could process 400 to 800 words a minute and we're only speaking 120 to 150 a minute, we should be able to really retain some information. Well, not quite. Because we can process a speaker's words and still have plenty of spare brain time, we are tempted to interrupt our listening by thinking about other things because we just have all this extra time to think of things. And that could be preforming things we want to say in our mind, just kind of drifting off as a whole. That is something that we need to be aware of. So focusing on delivery and personal appearance is also something that kind of happens when we don't concentrate. So unfortunately, sometimes we judge others by the way they look or the way they speak, and we don't listen to what they're actually saying to us. Now, is this always on purpose? Well, not always. I'm sure sometimes it is on purpose, but it's not always on purpose. Sometimes it can be a person's accent that you're just really intrigued with, and you miss out on the information because you're concentrating on the accent. It could be personal appearance. You're focusing so much on that person's personal appearance that you're not concentrating to the message. It could also just be vocal mannerisms that they are presenting. Any of those things can cause us to become distracted and not concentrate on the message. Now, most students do not think of listening as an active process that they can control, but you can. Um, you can do this by taking listening seriously, really striving to work on your active listening skills. Also, restricting distractions. When we limit as much as we can control, at least, external and internal noises, it calls us to be a better active listener. And don't forget that we discuss internal and external noises. An example of an external noise would be the humming of an air conditioner or the TV playing in the background. Let me think of some things you can actually control. A TV playing in the background, music playing loudly in the room. Trying to think of other things, but you kind of see where I'm going with that. Those are things that we can control. So if someone's trying to talk to you and you want to really try to be an active listener, turn the TV off. Listen to what they have to say. Internal noises are things such as the little voice we hear in our heads sometimes. So if you are trying to actively listen to someone, don't make mental notes on grocery lists in your mind. Don't think about what household chores need to be done. You need to try to focus on what the speaker is trying to relay to you. Don't be diverted by appearance or delivery. If you're interested in that person's accent or whatever, try to tune that out and really focus on the message they are trying to tell you. Suspend judgment. Don't make judgments on people or things or events before you know them. We should just suspend judgment as a whole. Excuse me. Focus your listening. You want to try to listen for main points. You also want to listen for evidence. Speakers should work to provide this in their speeches by being accurate. So we can provide evidence for a listener or for audience members in our speeches by being accurate, using responsible and objective research, using evidence relevant to the speaker's claim, and providing sufficient research to support the speaker's points. It's very important for us to understand that. And also just overall choosing to be an active listener. Now, you've heard me using that term a few times today, and I want to describe what that is. What is active listening? Active listening is giving our undivided attention to a speaker in a genuine effort to understand the speaker's point of view. Also, we can develop note-taking skills. That can be of great help to us in certain situations. When delivering a speech, I want you to always use a keyword outline on your note cards. You've heard me actually talk about that in the first lecture for this lesson, but what is a keyword outline? A keyword outline is an outline that briefly notes a speaker's main points and supporting evidence in a rough outline form. So why do we want to use a keyword outline on our note cards? Well, for one, when we're using only keywords and not writing out our entire speech, that helps us to avoid reading, which is something that will very quickly lose your listener if you're reading to them and not actually being dynamic in your speech. It also allows us to reduce speaker anxiety because we have keywords and phrases in front of us on our note cards that are properly organized. And if for some reason we lose our train of thought or we lose our place in our speech, all we have to do is glance down at those keywords and it'll jog our memory as to where we were. Also, it allows for that extemporaneous delivery that we've already spoke about. We never want to memorize our speeches in this class. We always want to deliver our speeches extemporaneously. And don't forget that as far as how listening and diversity can come together, don't forget that the knowledge, experience, goals, values, and attitudes through which each listener filters a message is that listener's own frame of reference, like we previously discussed. each of our frame of references will differ, so we have to take that in consideration when we are working to best tailor our message for our audience or for our listeners as a whole. All right, so that is going to be it for lesson 1, lecture 2. If you have any questions at all, feel free to send me an email in the course. Otherwise, keep up the hard work and continue working on those assignments. I can't wait to see what you guys come up with. Thanks so much and have a great week.